Chapter 31, The Photograph. The next day was most peculiable, as Mrs. Partridge would say. Phoebe arrived at school with another message, which she found on her porch that morning. We never know the worth of water until the well is dry. It's a clue, Phoebe said. Maybe my mother's hidden in a well. I walked straight into bed when I went to my locker. That grapefruit aroma was in the air. You've got something on your face, he said. With soft, warm fingers, he rubbed the side of my face. It's probably your breakfast. I don't know what came over me. I was going to kiss him. I leaned forward just as he turned around and slammed the door of his locker. My lips ended up pressed against the cold metal locker. You're weird, Sal, he said. Kissing was thumpingly complicated. Both people had to be in the same place at the same time, and both people had to remain still so that the kiss ended up in the right place. But I was relieved that my lips ended up on the cold metal locker. I could not imagine what had come over me, or what might have happened if the kiss had landed on Ben's mouth. It was a shivery thing to consider. I made it through the rest of my classes without losing control of my lips. Mr. Berkway sailed into class carrying out our journals. I had forgotten all about them. He was leaping all over the place, exclaiming, "Dynamite! Unbelievable! Incredible!" He said he couldn't wait to share the journals with the class. Mary Lou Finney said, "Share with the class?" Mr. Berkway said, "Not to worry. Everyone has something magnificent to say. I haven't read through every page yet, but I wanted to share some of these passages with you right away." People were squirming all over the room. I was trying to remember what I had written. Mary Lou leaned over to me and said, "Well, I'm not worried. I wrote a special note in the front of mine distinctly asking him not to read it. Mine was private." Mr. Berkway smiled at each nervous face. "You needn't worry," he said. "I'll change any names that you've used, and I'll fold this piece of yellow paper over the cover of whichever journal I'm reading, so that you won't know whose it is." Ben asked if he could go to the bathroom. Christy said she felt sick and begged to see the nurse. Phoebe asked me to touch her forehead because she was pretty sure she had a fever. Usually Mr. Berkway would let people go to the bathroom or to the nurse, but this time he said, "Let's not malinger." He picked up a journal, slipping the yellow paper over before anyone had a chance to examine the cover for clues as to its author's identity. Everyone took a deep breath. You could see people poised nervously, waiting as tensely as if Mr. Berkway was going to announce someone's execution. Mr. Berkway read, "I think that Betty," he changed the name, you could tell, because there was no Betty in our school, "will go to hell because she always takes the Lord's name in vain. She says 'God' every 5 seconds. Mary Lou Finney was turning purple. "Who wrote that?" she said. "Did you, Christy? I'll bet you did." Christy stared down at her desk. "I do not say 'God' every 5 seconds. I do not. And I'm not going to hell. Omnipotent, that's what I say now. I say omnipotent and Alpha and Omega." Mr. Berkway was desperately trying to explain what he had enjoyed about that passage. He said that most of us are not aware that we might be using words such as God that offend other people. Mary Lou leaned over to me and said, "Is he serious? Does he actually really and truly believe that beef-brained Christy is troubled by my saying God? Which I do not, by the way, say any more anyway." Christy wore a pious look, as if God himself had just come down from heaven to sit on her desk. Mr. Berkway quickly selected another journal. He read, "Linda," there was no Linda in our class either, "is my best friend. I tell her just about everything, and she tells me everything, even things I do not want to know, like what she ate for breakfast, and what her father wears to bed, and how much her new sweater costs. Sometimes things like that are just not interesting." Mr. Berkway liked this passage because it showed that even though someone might be our best friend, he or she could still drive us crazy. Beth Ann turned all the way around in her seat and sent wicked eyebrow messages to Mary Lou. Mr. Berkway flipped ahead in the same journal to another passage. He read, "I think Jeremiah is pig-headed. His skin is always pink and his hair is always clean and shiny. But he is really a jerk." I thought Mary Lou Finney was going to fall out of her chair. Alex was bright pink. He looked at Mary Lou as if she had recently plunged a red-hot stake into his heart. Mary Lou said, No, it isn't what you think. Mr. Birkway liked this passage because it showed conflicting feelings about someone. I'll say it does, Alex said. The bell rang. First you could hear sighs of relief from the people whose journals had not been read. And then people started talking a mile a minute. Hey, Mary Lou, look at Alex's pink skin. And hey, Mary Lou, what does Beth Ann's father wear to bed? Beth Ann was standing 1 inch away from Mary Lou's face. I do not talk on and on, Beth Ann said. And that wasn't very nice of you to mention that. And I do not tell you everything. The only reason I ever mentioned what my father wore to bed was because we were talking, and if you recall, about men's bathing suits being more comfortable than women's, and on she went. Mary Lou was trying to get across the room to Alex, who was standing there as pink as can be. Alex, she called, wait, I wrote that before. Wait. It was a jing-bang of a mess. I was glad I had to get out of there. Phoebe and I were going to the police again. We got in to see Sergeant Binkle right away. Phoebe slapped the newest message about the water in the well onto his desk, dumped the hairs which she had collected at Mrs. Cadaver's house on top of the message, and then placed her list of further items to investigate on top of that. Sergeant Bickle frowned. I don't think you girls understand. Phoebe went into a rage. You idiot, she said. She scooped up the message, the hairs, and her list and stormed out of the office. Sergeant Bickle followed her while I waited, thinking he would bring Phoebe back and calm her down. I looked at the photographs on his desk, the ones I had not been able to see the day before. In one was Sergeant Bickle and a friendly-looking woman. His wife, I supposed. The second picture was of a shiny black car. The third picture was of Sergeant Bickle, the woman, and a young man. Their son, I figured. I looked closer. I recognized the son. It was the lunatic. Chapter 32, Chicken and Blackberry Kisses. Gramps barreled through Wyoming like a house afire. We snaked through winding roads where the trees leaned close, rustling, rush, 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 rush. The road curved alongside rivers that rolled and gabbled, hurry, hurry, hurry. It was late when we arrived at Yellowstone. All we got to see that evening was a hot spring. We walked on boardwalks placed across the bubbling mud. Huzzah! Huzzah! Gramps said. And we stayed at the Old Faithful Inn in the frontier cabin. I'd never seen Gramps so excited. She couldn't wait for the next morning. We're going to see Old Faithful, she said over and over. It won't take too long, will it? I said. And I felt like a mule saying it because Gram was so looking forward to it. Don't you worry, Salmanica, Gramps said. We'll just watch that old geyser blow, and then we'll hit the road. I prayed all night long to the elm tree outside. I prayed that we would not get in an accident, that we would get to Lewiston, Idaho in time for my mother's birthday, and that we would bring her home. Later, I would realize that I had prayed for the wrong things. That night, Gram was so excited that she could not sleep. She rambled on about all sorts of things. She said to Gramps, Remember that letter from the Eggman that you found under the mattress? Of course I remember. We had a wing-ding of an argument over it. You told me you had no dang idea how it got there. You said the Eggman must have slipped into the bedroom and put it there. Well, I want you to know that I put it there. I know that, Gramps said. I'm not a complete noodle. It's the only love letter anybody ever wrote me, Gramps said. You never wrote me any love letters. You never told me you wanted one. To me, Gramps said, your grandfather nearly killed the Eggman over that letter. Hell's bells, Gramps said. He wasn't worth killing. Maybe not, but Gloria was. Ah, yes, Gramps said, placing his hand on his heart and pretending to swoon. Gloria. Cut that out, Gramps said, rolling over on her side. Tell me about Peebee. Tell me that story, but don't make it too awfully sad. She folded her hands on her chest. Tell me what happened with the lunatic. When I saw the picture of the lunatic on Sergeant Bickle's desk, I tore out of that office faster than lightning. I ran past Sergeant Bickle standing in the parking lot. No sign of Phoebe. I ran all the way to her house. As I passed Mrs. Cadaver's house, Mrs. Partridge called to me from the porch. You're all dressed up, I said. Going somewhere? Oh, yes, she said. I'm readable. She tottered down the steps, swinging her cobra cane in front of her. Are you walking? I asked. She reached down and touched her legs. Isn't that what you call it when you move your legs like I'm doing? No, I meant, are you walking to wherever you're going? Oh no, it's much too far for these legs. Jimmy's coming. He'll be here any minute. A car pulled up in front of the house. There he is, she said. She called out to the driver. I'm readable. I said I would be, and here I am. The driver leaped out of the car. Sal, he said. I had no idea you two were neighbors. It was Mr. Birkway. We're not, I said. It's Phoebe who is the neighbor. Is that right? He said, opening the car door for Mrs. Partridge. Come on, Mom. Let's get a move on. Mom, I said. I looked at Mrs. Partridge. This is your son? Why, of course, Mrs. Partridge said. This is my little Jimmy. But he's a Birkway. Mrs. Partridge said, I was a Birkway once. Then I was a Partridge. I'm still a Partridge. Then who is Mrs. Cadaver? I said. My little Margie, she said. She was a Birkway too. Now she's a Cadaver. I said to Mr. Birkway, Mrs. Cadaver is your sister? We're twins, Mr. Birkway said. When they had driven away, I knocked at Phoebe's door, but there was no answer. At home, I dialed Phoebe's number over and over. No answer. The next day at school, I was relieved to see Phoebe. Where were you? I said. I have something to tell you. She turned away. I don't want to talk about it, she said. I do not wish to discuss it. I couldn't figure out what was the matter with her. It was a terrible day. We had tests in math and science. At lunch, Phoebe ignored me. Then came English. Mr. Birkway skipped into the room. People were gnawing on their fingers and tapping their feet and wriggling around and generally getting ulcers, wondering if Mr. Birkway was going to read from the journals. I stared at him. He and Margaret Cadaver were twins? Was that possible? The most disappointing part of that piece of knowledge was that he was not going to fall in love with Mrs. Cadaver and marry her and take her away. Mr. Birkway opened a cupboard, pulled out the journals, slipped the yellow paper over the cover of one, and read, This is what I like about Jane. She is smart, but doesn't act like she knows everything. She is cute. She smells good. She is cute. She makes me laugh. She is cute. I got a prickly feeling up and down my arms. I wondered if Ben had written this about me. But then I realized that Ben didn't even know me when he wrote his journal. A little buzz was going around the room as people shifted in their seats. Christy was smiling. Megan was smiling. Beth Ann was smiling. Mary Lou was smiling. Every girl in the room was smiling. Each girl thought this had been written about her. I looked carefully at each of the boys. Alex was gazing nonchalantly at Mr. Birkway. Then I saw Ben. He was sitting with his hands over his ears, staring down at his desk. The prickly feeling traveled all the way up to my neck and then went skipping down my spine. He did write that, but he did not write it about me. Mr. Birkway exclaimed, Ah, love! Ah, life! Sighing, he pulled out another journal and read, Jane doesn't know the first thing about boys. She once asked me what kisses taste like, so you could tell she hadn't ever kissed anyone. I told her that they taste like chicken, and she believed me. She is so dumb sometimes. Mary Lou Finney jumped out of her chair. You cabbage head, she said to Beth Ann. You beef brain. Beth Ann wound a strand of hair around her finger. Mary Lou said, I did not believe you, and I do know what they taste like, and it isn't chicken. Ben drew a cartoon of two stick figures kissing in the air. Over their heads was a cartoon bubble with a chicken saying, Bawk, bawk, bawk. Mr. Birkway turned a few pages in the same journal and read, I hate doing this. I hate to write. I hate to read. I hate journals. I especially hate English where teachers only talk about idiot symbols. I hate that idiot poem about the snowy woods, and I hate it when people say the woods symbolize death or beauty or sex or any old thing you want. I hate that. Maybe the woods are just woods. Beth Ann stood up. Mr. Birkway, she said, I do hate school. I do hate books. I do hate English. I do hate symbols, and I most especially hate these idiot journals. There was a hush in the room. Mr. Birkway stared at Beth Ann for a minute, and in that minute I was reminded of Mrs. Cadaver. For that brief time his eyes looked just like hers. I was afraid he was going to strangle Beth Ann. But then he smiled. His eyes became friendly, enormous cow eyes once again. I think he hypnotized her because Beth Ann sat down slowly. Mr. Birkway said, Beth Ann, I know exactly how you feel. Exactly. I love this passage. You do, she said. It's so honest. I had to admit you couldn't get more honest than Beth Ann telling her English teacher that she hated symbols in English and idiot journals. Mr. Berkway said, I used to feel exactly like this. I could not understand what all the fuss was about symbols. He rummaged around in his desk. I want to show you something. He was pulling papers out and flinging them around. Finally, he held up a picture. Ah, here it is. Dynamite. What is this? He asked Ben. Ben said, It's a vase, obviously. Mr. Berkway held the drawing in front of Beth Ann, who looked as if she might cry. Mr. Berkway said, Beth Ann, what do you see? A little tear dropped down on her cheek. It's okay, Beth Ann. What do you see? I don't see any idiot vase, she said. I see two people. They're looking at each other. Right, Mr. Berkway said. Bravo. I'm right. Bravo. Ben said, Huh? Two people? I was thinking the same thing myself. What two people? Mr. Berkway said to Ben, And you were right too. Bravo. He asked everyone else, How many see a vase? About half the class raised their hands. And how many see two faces? The rest of the class raised their hands. Then Mr. Berkway pointed out how you could see both. If you looked only at the white part in the center, you clearly see the vase. If you looked only at the dark parts on the side, you could see two profiles. The curvy sides of the vase became the outline of the two heads facing each other. Mr. Berkway said that the drawing was a bit like symbols. Maybe the artist only intended to draw a vase, and maybe some people look at this picture and see only that vase. That is fine, but if some people look at it and see faces, what is wrong with that? It is faces to that person who is looking at it. And what is even more magnificent? You might see both. Beth Ann said, Two for your money? Isn't it interesting, Mr. Berkway said, to find both? Isn't it interesting to discover that snowy woods could be death and beauty and even, I suppose, sex? Wow, literature. Did he say sex? Ben said, copying the drawing. I thought Mr. Berkway was finished with the journals for that day, but he made a great show of closing his eyes and pulling something from near the bottom of the stack. She popped the blackberries into her mouth. Then she looked all around. It was mine. I could hardly bear it. She took 2 steps up to the maple tree and threw her arms around it and kissed it. People were giggling. I thought I could detect a small dark stain as from a blackberry kiss. Ben looked at me from across the room. After Mr. Berkway read about my mother's blackberry kiss, he read about how I kissed the tree, and how I have kissed all different kinds of trees since then, and how each tree has a special taste all its own, and mixed in with that taste is the taste of blackberries. By now, because both Ben and Phoebe were staring at me, everyone else stared too. She kisses trees, Megan said. I might have died right then and there if Mr. Berkway had not immediately picked up another journal. He stabbed his finger into the middle of the page and read, I am very concerned about Mr. Berkway stared down at the page. It looked as if he couldn't read the handwriting. He started again. I am very concerned about Mrs. Corpse. Her suspicious behavior suggests that she has murdered her own husband. Phoebe's eyes blinked rapidly. Go on, Ben said. Finish. You could tell that Mr. Berkway was regretting that he had ever started this business with the journals. But all around the room people were shouting, Yes, finish! And so he reluctantly continued, I believe she has buried him in her backyard. When the bell rang, people went berserk. Wow, a murder? Who wrote that? And is it real? I was out of that room faster than anything chasing after Phoebe. Megan called out after me, You kiss trees. I tore out of the building. No Phoebe. Idiot journals, I thought. Gold darn idiot journals. Chapter 33, The Visitor. Graham and Gramps were both still awake in our frontier cabin on the edge of Yellowstone National Park. Aren't you sleepy yet? I said. Graham said, I don't know what's the matter with me. I don't feel like going to sleep at all. I want to know what happened to Peebee. I'll tell you about Mr. Berkway's visit, then I'll stop for tonight. I went over to Phoebe's after dinner for the day. Mr. Birkway had read from my journal about the blackberry kisses, and Phoebe's about Mrs. Cadaver. In Phoebe's bedroom, I said, "I've got 2 important things to tell you." The doorbell rang, and we heard a familiar voice. "That sounds like Mr. Birkway," Phoebe said. "That's one of the things I want to tell you," I said, "about Mr. Birkway." There was a tap on Phoebe's door. Her father said, "Phoebe, could you and Sal come downstairs with me?" I thought Mr. Birkway was going to be mad at Phoebe from what she had written about his sister. The worst thing was that Phoebe didn't even know yet that Mrs. Cadaver was Mr. Birkway's sister. I felt like we were lambs being led to the slaughter. "Take us," I thought. "Take us and do away with us quickly." We followed Phoebe's father downstairs. There on the sofa was Mr. Birkway holding Phoebe's journal and looking embarrassed. "That is my own private journal," Phoebe said, "with my own private thoughts." "I know," Mr. Birkway said, "and I want to apologize for reading it aloud." Apologize? That was a relief. It was so quiet in the room that I could hear the leaves being blown off the trees outside. Mr. Birkway coughed. "I want to explain something," he said. "Mrs. Cadaver is my sister." "Your sister?" Phoebe said. "And her husband is dead." "I thought so," Phoebe said. "But she didn't murder him," Mr. Birkway said. "Her husband died when a drunk driver rammed into his car. My mother, Mrs. Partridge, was also in the car with Mr. Cadaver. She didn't die, as you know, but she lost her sight." "Oh," I said. Phoebe stared at the floor. "My sister Margaret was the nurse on duty in the emergency room when they brought in her husband and our mother. Margaret's husband died that night." The whole time Mr. Birkway was talking, Phoebe's father was sitting beside her with his hand resting on her shoulder. It looked like the only thing that was keeping Phoebe from vaporizing into the air and disappearing was his hand resting there. "I just wanted you to know," Mr. Birkway said, "that Mr. Cadaver is not buried in her backyard. I've also just learned about your mother, Phoebe, and I'm sorry that she's gone, but I assure you that Margaret would not have kidnapped or murdered her." After Mr. Birkway left, Phoebe and I sat on the front porch. Phoebe said, "If Mrs. Cadaver didn't kidnap or murder my mother, then where is she? What can I do? Where should I look?" "Phoebe," I said, "there's something I've got to tell you." "Look, Sal, if you're going to tell me she's not coming back, I don't want to hear it. You might as well go home now." "I know who the lunatic is. It's Sergeant Bickle's son." And so we devised the plan. At home that night, all I could think about was Mrs. Cadaver. I could see her in her white uniform working in the emergency room. I could see an ambulance pulling up with its blue lights flashing, and her walking briskly to the swinging doors with her wild hair all around her face. I could see the stretchers being wheeled in, and I could see Mrs. Cadaver looking down at them. I could feel her heart thumping like mad as she realized it was her own husband and her own mother lying there. I imagined Mrs. Cadaver touching her husband's face. It was as if I was walking in her moccasins. That's how much my own heart was pumping and my own hands were sweating. I started wondering if the birds of sadness had built their nests in Mrs. Cadaver's hair afterward, and if so, how she got rid of them. Her husband dying and her mother being blinded were events that would matter in the course of a lifetime. I saw everyone else going on with their own agendas while Mrs. Cadaver was frantically trying to keep her husband and her mother alive. Did she regret anything? Did she know the worth of water before the well was dry? All those messages had invaded my brain and affected the way I looked at things. "Are you sleepy yet, Gram?" I asked. My voice was hoarse from talking so much. "No, Chickabiddy, but you go on to sleep. I'm just going to lie here a while and think about things." She nudged Gramps. "You forgot to say about the marriage bed." Gramps yawned. "Sorry, Gooseberry." He patted the bed and said it. Chapter 34, Old Faithful. That next day was probably one of the best and surely the worst in Gramps' lives. The whispers woke me early. It was the 6th day, and the next day was my mother's birthday. We had to get out of Wyoming and through Montana. Gramps was already up, but Gram was lying on the bed staring at the ceiling. "Did you ever go to sleep?" I asked. "No," she said. "I didn't feel like sleeping. I can sleep later." She climbed out of bed. Let's go see that Old Faithful. I've waited my entire life to see Old Faithful. You sure you got your heart set on that? Don't you, you stubborn gooseberry, said Gramps. I sure do, Gram said. We parked the car and walked up a low hill. I was afraid Gram was going to be disappointed because it didn't look like much at first. There was a rope fence around a mound on the side of the hill. The ground was scrappy dirt, and in the center of the rope enclosure, about 20 feet away, was a hole. Heck, Gram said. Can't we get any closer than this? Gramps and I walked over to read a sign about Old Faithful. A park ranger rushed past us yelling, Ma'am! Ma'am! God dang, Gramps said. Gram was crawling under the rope. The ranger stopped her. Ma'am, there's a reason for that rope, he said. Gram brushed off her dress. I just wanted a better look. Don't worry, the ranger said. You'll get a good look. Please stay behind the rope. The sign said that Old Faithful was due to erupt in 15 minutes. More and more people gathered around the rope. There were people of all ages, little babies crying, grannies sitting on folding stools, teenagers plunged into radio headsets, couples smooching. There were people speaking languages other than English. Next to us was a tour group of Italians. Across the way was a group of Germans. Gram tapped her fingers together, getting more and more excited. Is it time? She kept saying. Is it almost time? The crowd became quiet. A few minutes before Old Faithful was due to go off, everyone stared at the hole. Everyone was listening. Is it time? Gram said. There was a faint noise and a little spit shot out of the hole. The man next to me said, Ah, is that all? Another noise, this time a little louder, a grating and crunching sound like walking on gravel. 2 fitful spits. Ah, the man said. Then it was like the radiator boiling over or the tea kettle blowing its top. Old Faithful hissed and steamed. A sudden spout of water shot out, maybe 3 feet high. Ah, the man said. Is that all? More steam, boiling and hissing, and a huge jing-bang spray of water surged out, climbing and then more and more, until it looked like a whole river of water was shooting straight up into the air. It looks like an upside-downy waterfall, Gram said. All the while there was a walloping hissing, and I could have sworn the ground rumbled and trembled underneath us. The warm mist blew towards us, and people started backing away. All except Gram. She stood there grinning, tilting her face up to the mist and staring at the fountain of water. Oh, she said, oh, huzzah, huzzah. She shouted it into the air in noise. Gramps wasn't watching Old Faithful. He was watching Gram. He put his arms around her and hugged her. You like this old geyser, don't you? He said. Oh, Gram said. Oh, yes, I do. The man next to me was staring open-mouthed at Old Faithful. Lordy, he said. Lordy, that's amazing. Gradually, Old Faithful slowed down. We watched it undo itself and retreat into its hole. We stood there even after everyone else had drifted away. At last, Gram sighed and said, Okay, let's go. We were inside the car and about to leave when Gram started to cry. God dang, Gram said. What's the matter? Gram sniffled. Oh, nothing. I'm so happy I got to see Old Faithful. You old gooseberry, Gram said, and on we went. We're going to eat up Montana, Gram said. We're going to get to the Idaho border tonight. You watch me. I'm putting this pedal to the metal. He stepped on the gas and peeled out of the parking lot. Idaho, here we come. Chapter 35, The Plan. All day long we ate up the road through Montana. It hadn't looked so far on the map, but it was all mountains. We started in the foothills of the Rockies as we left Yellowstone, and all day we climbed up and down. Sometimes the road snaked along the side of a cliff, and the only thing between us and the sharp drop was a piddly railing. Often as we sailed around a bend, we came face to face with a camping trailer swinging its wide body around the curve. These roads are a danger, Gramps said, but he was like a little kid riding a hobby horse. Giddy up, let's get a move on, he said, encouraging the car up a hill. Hee-yah, he said as we swept down the other side. I felt as if I was torn in pieces. Half of me was oogling the scenery. I had to admit that it was pretty, as maybe even prettier than Bybanks. Trees and rocks and mountains, rivers and flowers, deer and moose and rabbits. It was an amazing country, an enormous country. But the other half of me was quivering pile of jelly. I could see our car bursting through the railing and plunging down the cliff. As we approached each curve, I could see us smashing straight on into a trunk or a camper. Every time I saw a bus, I watched it sway. I watched its tires spin dangerously close to the gravel at the road's edge. I watched it plunge on, eating up the road, defying those curves. Graham sat quietly, with her hands folded on her lap. I thought she might sleep, especially after staying awake all night, but she didn't. She wanted to hear about Peebee, so all day long, as I took in the scenery, and as I imagined us in 1,000 accidents, and as I prayed underneath all to any tree whizzing by, I talked about Peebee. I wanted to tell it all today. I wanted to finish it. On the day after Mr. Berkway appeared at Phoebe's house and told us about Mr. Cadaver, Phoebe and I put our plan in motion. We were going to track down Sergeant Pickle's son and, according to Phoebe, discover the whereabouts of Phoebe's mother. I wasn't positive that Sergeant Pickle's son was a lunatic, and I wasn't convinced he would lead us to Phoebe's mother, but enough of Phoebe's tales had been transplanted into my brain so that I was caught up in the plan. Like Phoebe, I was ready to take some action. We could hardly sit all day at school. Phoebe especially was fired up. She was worried, too. She was afraid we might not discover her mother alive, and I was beginning to share that fear. At school, everyone was still buzzing about the journal readings. Everyone wanted to know who had written about the murder. Alex avoided Mary Lou because what she had said about his being a pink jerk, and Mary Lou avoided Beth Ann because of what Beth Ann had written about the chicken kisses. Megan and Chrissy taunted Beth Ann with, "Did you really tell Mary Lou that kisses taste like chicken? Did she really believe you?" And they taunted me with, "Do you really kiss trees? Didn't you know you're supposed to kiss boys?" In English class, everyone badgered Mr. Berkway to finish reading the journal entry that he had begun yesterday, the one about Mrs. Corpse and the body. But Mr. Berkway did not read any more journals. Instead, he apologized for hurting people's feelings by reading their private thoughts aloud, and he sent us to the library. There, Ben trailed me. If I looked at the fiction section, he was right beside me. If I moved over to examine the magazines, there he was flipping through one as well. Once his face made contact with my shoulder, he was definitely trying to plant a kiss on me. I knew he was, but there was nothing I could do about it. I could not help it that whenever he aimed his mouth in my direction, my body was already moving away. I needed a little warning. I tried remaining completely still for several consecutive minutes, and during those minutes I detected Ben leaning slightly toward me several times. Each time, however, he drew back as if someone were controlling him by an invisible thread. Across the library, Beth Ann called, "Sale, there's a spider! Oh, Sale, kill it!" When the final bell rang, Phoebe and I were out of school like a shot. At Phoebe's house, we examined the telephone directory. "We've got to hurry," Phoebe said, "before Prudence or my father comes home." There were 6 Bickles listed in the directory. We took turns calling. Each time we asked for Sergeant Bickle. The first 2 people said we must have the wrong number. The 3rd number we dialed was busy. The 4th, no answer. The 5th was answered by a crotchety woman who said, "I don't know any sergeants." The 6th number was answered by an elderly man who must have been lonely because he talked on and on about once knowing Sergeant Freeman and the war, but that was back in 1944, and he also knew a Sergeant Bones and a Sergeant Dowdy, but he did not know a Sergeant Bickle. "What are we going to do?" Phoebe wailed. "Prudence will be home any minute, and we still don't know which is the right Bickle." The busy number was still busy. The previously unanswered one rang, and just as Phoebe was about to hang up, she heard a voice. "Hello?" she said. "May I speak with Sergeant Bickle, please?" There was a pause as she listened. "He's still at work." Phoebe was jumping up and down. "Thank you," she said, trying to make her voice serious. "I'll call later." No message. Thank you." "Yes," she said when she hung up. "Yes, yes, yes." She was hugging me half to death. "You'll have to do phase 2 tonight." That night, while my father was at Margaret's, I phoned the Bickles. I prayed that Sergeant Bickle wouldn't answer, but I was prepared to disguise my voice in case he did. The phone rang and rang. I hung up. I rehearsed my voice and what I would say. I tried again. On the 7th ring, the phone was answered. It was Sergeant Bickle. "My name is Susan Longfellow," I said. "I'm a friend of your son's. I was wondering if I might speak with him." I prayed and prayed that he had only one son. He isn't here, Sergeant Bickle said. Would you like to leave a message? Do you know when he'll be home? There was a pause. How did you say you knew my son? This made me serious. How do I know your son? Well, that's a long story. Basically, the way I know him is... Actually, this is a little embarrassing to admit. My hands were sweating so much I could hardly hang on to the phone. The library, yes, I know him from the library, and he loaned me a book, but I've lost the book. Maybe you should explain this all to him, Sergeant Bickle said. Yes, maybe I should do that. I wonder why he gave you this phone number, he said. I wonder why he didn't give you his number at school. At school? Actually, the thing is, I think he did give me that number too, but I've lost it. You sure lose a lot of things, he said. Would you like his number at school? Yes, I said. Or better yet, maybe you could give me his address and I'll just send him the book. I thought you said you lost the book. Actually, yes, but I'm hoping to find it, I said. I see, he said. Just a minute. There was a muffled pause as he put his hand over the receiver and called, Honey, where's Mike's address? Mike. Brilliant. A name. I felt like the chief inspector. I felt like I had just discovered the most important clue in the criminal investigation of the century. To top it off, Sergeant Bickle gave me Mike's address. I was sorely tempted to end the conversation by informing Sergeant Bickle that his son was a potential lunatic, but I refrained. I thanked him and immediately phoned Phoebe. You're brilliant, she said. Tomorrow we'll nail Mike the lunatic.